Hello everyone, I'm Tommaso Giardini. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Digital Policy Alerts webinar on US digital policy after the US election. Let me start by explaining who we are to host this conversation. The Digital Policy Alert is an independent Swiss nonprofit that's devoted to transparency in digital regulation. So every day we track laws and regulations and enforcement cases across the world and publish them on our open access website. With this transparency, we are trying to help policymakers, civil society, and companies like you to learn about different regulatory approaches. And from this context, I am very excited for today's opportunity to moderate a panel on US digital policy after the election. Because the US presidential election is the key political moment of 2024. But how does it play into digital policy? What is the state of US digital policy 3 weeks before the election? Our goal today is to discuss this on 3 levels. So at the international level, the federal, and then the state level. We will first begin with the international context, then discuss what is happening or not happening in Washington, D.C., and finally move to the state level. And you will have time for a question and answer so that you can engage with the experts. My colleague Maria Buza is here to manage the Q&A. And please make active use of the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to share your thoughts, reactions, and questions throughout the webinar. Maria will curate it. And to kick things off, I'd like to de-ice the Q&A channel now. So please, dear attendees, help our panel understand where our audience is based. Just drop in your location in the Q&A channel now. And thank you very much. And while the responses roll in, I will briefly introduce our 3 panelists. So I'm very excited to welcome Mark Scott from the Atlantic Council. Mark is a senior resident fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab. He was previously chief technology correspondent for Politico, and he writes the Digital Politics newsletter, which I strongly recommend to anyone interested in digital geopolitics. Mark, thank you for being here. Then I want to welcome Theodora Skeadas, who provides independent tech policy consulting among many other mandates. Theo consults a range of organizations on a range of tech policy topics, for example, humane intelligence on algorithmic audits, Microsoft on election policies, and the Partnership on AI on responsible AI. And she has built a tracker of US tech policy for the Integrity Institute that tracks both federal and state level developments. Theo, thank you to you as well for joining us. And then last but not least, I have the pleasure to welcome Cobun Zweifel-Keegan. He's the managing director of the International Association of Privacy Professionals in Washington, D.C. The IAPP is the leading organization that translates global privacy rules into concrete corporate policy and professional training programs. And as they are expanding from privacy to the broader realm of digital governance, they provide a wealth of resources, including trackers and analyses and helpful red lines by Cobun himself. So Cobun, thank you for being here as well. Excellent. Check out the Q&A now. So we have people from Paris, from London, from Geneva, from Zurich, but also someone who's joining us from Tokyo. So thank you very much for staying up late. We see that there's someone from the New York and Massachusetts as well. And in that sense, I want to welcome this very diverse audience. I will stop speaking at this point. I will start handing it over to our esteemed panelists. And let's dive right in with a very broad perspective here. I'll kick it off with Mark and then ask to hand over to Theo and Cobun. How would you situate US digital policy in the current international context? Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tommaso. Thank you to the panelists. It's an easy topic to get us going, so thanks for that. We should put this into, as you say, some context. We don't know what's going to happen come November. The polls are too close, even if you look at the swing states. So let's just take we don't know the outcome, but I would suggest, at least from an international perspective, and this is not what many people near Harris or Trump want to hear, I don't see much difference from an international perspective on digital policy between both campaigns. What we've seen over the last 8 years, both with the Trump and then Biden administration, is a shift toward a national security, economic, trade policy approach to digital. That you can see that in data flows, you can see that in the role of, what do you do with China, the relationship with both allies, those in Europe and elsewhere. We have someone from Tokyo, so Japan would be very much amongst that. And on that point, I would suggest any new administration is going to continue a hawkish approach to China. They're going to link trade policy with tech and national security, uh, and that's not going to change. And so, what does that mean for both the US and its allies and others? It means we will still see export bans coming on a variety of technologies aimed at China. We'll be looking at nudging global majority countries to get rid of Huawei telco equipment and buy Ericsson, Nokia, and Cisco and all the other American providers. And so from that perspective, we can discuss domestically how they were different, and we'll get into that later in this conversation. But for an international audience like we have now, I think you need to see this as business as usual. And that's not because the Harris and Trump tone will be the same. We can imagine Trump maybe taking a more bellicose view on allies and economic rivals than Harris does. But in terms of the actual output on digital policy, a lot of it's going to be about promoting free markets and an open interoperable internet, which has been sort of the standard for all Western/US policy for decades. But on top of that, a national security focus, a economic trade focus, which is going to be very hawkish, very aggressive, particularly to China and to a lesser degree Russia. And to a degree, we will be seeing both the Harris and Trump administration, from my perspective, internationally, setting two allies, you're either with us on this or you're against us. There's going to be a very binary choice in terms of how they see the world and how you either want to basically hobble China or you want to facilitate China. So that's how I would see it, at least from my perspective.
And to add a slightly different framing, I wanted to emphasize two key things as we set the tone for the conversation. So one is that US digital policy making doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within an international context. And it also comes from all different stakeholders, including companies. And so that is in part where I have been situated within this space. So to the first point, I wanted to emphasize through the lens of AI, because that's where I've been doing a lot of policymaking work, some of the multilateral and international efforts that have influenced the development of digital policy when it comes to AI. So just in the last 2 years, we've seen AI principles coming out of UN work like UNESCO-related work, which has offered high-level guidance on principles and implementation. We saw in 2023 the G7 Hiroshima Principles and Code of Conduct that talked about project-based cooperation with organizations like the Global Partnership for AI and the OECD around multi-stakeholder outreach and consultation. The Council of Europe has weighed in. And then in October of last year, we saw at the UK AI Safety Summit, the Bletchley Declaration, which set out a comprehensive summary around risks and challenges and opportunities presented by AI, specifically frontier AI. And then fast forward to January of this year, we saw the EU AI Act manifest, which talked about high-level risks and prohibited practices around things like cognitive behavioral manipulation and emotion recognition and social scoring. A month later, we saw the AI Elections Accord come out of the February Munich Security Conference, where companies came together and took a pledge to detect and counter harmful AI content in elections. We've seen bodies like Sensenelec in Europe move forward on standards. We've also seen Singapore come forward with an AI regulatory sandbox for experimentation from a regulatory perspective. And then coming to the US, in September, the UN General Assembly took place based in New York. And this is where you can see companies having a big role to play in influencing digital policy. OpenAI had a major convening that was really the talk of the town, as well as other major events unfolding. And then looking ahead, we're seeing the France AI Safety Summit in February of next year, where they're engaging civil society globally in advance of the convening. And so just wanted to emphasize that the digital policy space in the US is very much influenced by and influences international conversations. US companies have an outsized role when it comes to the organizations that are under scrutiny from regulatory and legislative bodies globally, but they also look to influence that themselves. And so I just wanted to flag as well that when we see international fora, we also see international crises influencing domestic policymaking, often as a forcing function. So two examples are Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the beginning of 2022. It influenced digital policymaking, such as Twitter's crisis response policy, which I'll drop in the chat. I was working at Twitter at the time, and it helped influence how a company like Twitter saw its responsibility to managing influence operations when it comes to crises manifesting on digital platforms. And more recently, the crisis in Israel and Palestine, and now the broader Middle East, has been a forcing function for conversations around content moderation and surveillance issues, which are very much part and parcel with tech companies. So yeah, those are a few thoughts I wanted to share at the onset.
Thanks so much. I don't have much to add that would add much more color to what both Mark and Theodora have explained so eloquently. Certainly, I totally agree with everything that's been said, including the fact that all of policy, really all tech policy, does exist in a conversation that has many layers, both international. It overlaps internationally, it overlaps at the federal level, and in the US, there's also significant policy conversation that happens at the state level, and all of it is really connected. The states don't happen in a vacuum either. So none of us have really fallen out of coconut trees, and we are all part of the same discourse here. And so it is really important to keep geopolitics and other major factors in mind when you're thinking about policy tea leaf reading.
Well, excellent, excellent. Thanks. I think we could go on all day talking about the international context here. We will have to trim down on the scope. So I hope everyone has understood. I think you've summarized it very well, Cobun, in terms of this setting the scene for the conversation we're going to have now. We're going to move into the US now. So we will focus the rest of this conversation on first federal developments and then state level developments. Maybe Cobun, I'll leave it right with you when it comes to what's happening in Washington, D.C. You're based there. You seem to be on top of everything that moves or doesn't move in Washington. What's your impression of the current sort of state of digital Washington policy?
Sure. Well, thank you. Yeah, I certainly try to keep up with the privacy conversation and increasingly AI governance, cybersecurity, those sorts of things. The broader tech policy, I just can't keep up as well. And I use other tools like Theodora's awesome tracker of all of the things. It's helpful to have those broader scopes sometimes. But yeah, this is a weird time in Washington always. This is the weird quiet before the storm, right? We're in the weeks leading up to the election. So there's not a lot of policy happening at this moment. But it is always a moment to reflect and plan and think about what's coming next. And it is very difficult, as Mark said, to plan for the future because all of our elections are very close in the US. We don't know who is going to be in the White House. We don't know which party will be in control of the Senate or the House. And so it makes it hard as policy people to kind of plan our 2025 quarterly action items. But kind of reflecting back, it has been there hasn't been a lot accomplished in terms of legislative activity this term. There was a lot of talk of privacy. There's still a potential of some children's privacy. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But in terms of legislative kind of check boxes, there's not much for Congress to look back on. They did. This also dovetails with what Mark said. There were a couple of bills, protectionist bills about data flows, about banning certain apps controlled by foreign adversaries. Those kinds of things did get some traction, and we saw new laws signed that for the first time are kind of changing the U.S. discourse on data flows internationally, putting some friction, some pressure on reducing or at least putting checks and balances on how personal data flows outside of the United States, at least just to these countries of concern, as we put it. There has been a lot of other activity outside of Congress. The White House, the Biden-Harris administration has been very active on AI governance in particular, and also on some privacy issues with the big executive order on AI. I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit more. And then kind of all of the activities across the administration, across agencies that are implementing that. And in the meantime, all of the same kinds of activities maintain. Something I focus on a lot is the Federal Trade Commission and how they're enforcing privacy and AI governance best practices. But yeah, it's always busy, and right now kind of in this weird little lull. And I guess, as we'll talk about too, what happens when Congress isn't passing laws that everyone agrees need to be passed is the states start to act and start to experiment, and we've continued to see a lot happening in the states this term. But I guess we'll talk about that a little later. So let's start with federal.
Yeah. I think we'll keep teasing the state conversation, but we're keeping it off. Sort of, Theo, I'd hand it over to you. Do you get the same impression? Is sort of what other parts of the government are stepping in? What's your impression of federal digital policy in the US?
Yeah, I think agreed with what's been said. I would note that because we've had a divided Congress and it has been hard in some ways to move forward legislation, we've seen a lot, and Cobun mentioned this, a lot of forward momentum coming from the executive branch. So, for example, we've seen in July 2023, the White House voluntary AI commitments, which were driven by the White House as opposed to Congress. Companies made commitments around issues like safety, trust, and security when it came to AI. Then we saw the executive order come forth in October 2023, right around the UK AI Safety Summit last year, so just a year ago. And then we've seen guidance coming out of OMB, including most recently guidance that came out of OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget, which is a sort of understated but very significant federal agency in the US because it carries the purse strings for the government. And so most recently, they came forward with a document guiding government agencies on how to procure AI systems. And because the federal government is a major buyer of technology, this has outsized impact and can actually set a new standard. So we've seen a ton of information coming from the executive branch. And then I'll screen share for a second. I just wanted to highlight very briefly. So this is the tech policy tracker that we had put together. And you can see at the federal level, you're welcome to play around with it. You can even download the information. It's very interactive. You can see here a database of theoretically all of the legislation that was put forth by Congress in the 23-24 cycle. And then this document here highlights, and I wanted to show this slide in particular, highlights a summary of the legislation and its themes. So you can see here children or child safety, AI, and privacy, as well as cybersecurity, were really some driving themes when it comes to federal legislation that was put forward by Congress in the last cycle. Specifically, when it comes to AI, the themes have been issues like open source, risk assessments and transparency, watermarking, competition in digital markets, data protection, and other issues like deepfakes and privacy. So those are the themes that we've seen coming most robustly out of Congress in this last cycle.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Mark, I know it's hard to be the third one in all of these, so I'll cue you in on two things. So one is, I'm missing a branch of government here. I'm missing the courts, and out of all the topics that we've mentioned here, I'm missing the whole speech debate, or the online speech. Can I leave you the floor this way? Please expand.
Oh, I have feelings about this. Yes, okay. But before I get to that, just a couple of things to build on the great words from Theodora and Cobun. I spend a lot of my time looking at the outside the US, mostly because policymaking in the US is pretty much moribund across many things. I look at the amount of bills coming through Congress, and some of them are very good, some of them are not, but some of them are very good. they're not going to get passed. Like they're just not. And so I really dig Theodora's tracker, and I've used it for a while. But it's one of these things where you're looking and go, like, oh, does it even matter? Right? Like if this is just like talking points and press releases rather than actually getting legislation done, I just take a not somewhat overly skeptical view of the Beltway, mostly because digital is not a priority for anybody. You're not seeing any discussion of that in the most recent presidential election, other than maybe JD Vance saying that Facebook censors Trump, which we'll get into in a minute. So I just think from an international audience, which is on this call mostly, just because there are bills doesn't mean anything's going to get passed. And so I just think we need to be very clear about what's going to happen. And to your point about the courts, that's not just digital. We look at the Roe v. Wade decision and whether there's some significant decisions being made by the Supreme Court that affect all Americans' lives, not just the digital component. And that is primarily where this is getting done, along with the executive branch, purely because Congress is broken. It just is. This is not a party political discussion. They just can't get stuff done. And so you are looking at the states, so the Supreme Court kicking in and making, the Chevron decision recently is going to have massive impact, not just on digital. I'm not an expert in that, but just the idea is going to limit the ability of regulators and agencies to do their jobs. You look at the Supreme Court recently pushed back social media laws from Florida and Texas. They didn't say they were completely unconstitutional. They just said the states needed to tweak them. And so those were two state-based rules. And again, not trying to skip steps because we want to get to the states in a minute, but there was an effort to at least put some restrictions, particularly on age, around social media and what could and could not be posted or seen by particularly teenagers. And the Supreme Court stepped in and said, not now, but go back and have a think, says the non-lawyer. So please check that with a lawyer before you use it. So there's that. So the Supreme Court and the very non-technical based judges on the Supreme Court are making massive decisions. But again, that's not just a digital issue. That is a societal wide issue in the US. On the censorship, free speech discussion, it is really interesting to contrast the US discussion with overseas. Whereas overseas, particularly here in Europe, where I'm based, we're in the nitty gritty, the wonkiness of social media audits and risk assessments and systemic risk and all like the wonkery that I presume everyone on this call loves to get into. In the US, that is not happening. You have either from the right, social media is censoring right-wing voices, or on the left, you're allowing extremism to spread like wildfire. The answer is somewhere in between, right? But what you've seen is because it's become such a political issue, and that's not just Section 230, it's the role of federal agencies working with social media companies to take down online extremism. It's looking at how we research and improve transparency on social media platforms. All that has stopped. So in terms of what we see in front of before the 2024 election, and I spend a lot of my time looking at the nastiness, both foreign and domestic, when it comes to the election interference potentially. We don't have any view. There's literally no transparency and accountability on the platforms because there is no more work being done on that for political reasons. Because most people, and I put researchers into this bucket, have been targeted by certain elements within Congress, and it's just stopped. The money's run out. They've been sued or they've been subpoenaed, and there's just been a chilling effect on transparency. And that's not to suggest anyone wants to censor people's free speech. It's more the ability to track where bad stuff is happening on social media is in a worse position now in 2024 than it was before the 2016 election.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that so the state of it isn't excellent, but your explanation of it is. Theo, I think that last point especially is something that's close to you. So I'll give you some time to respond to that.
Yeah, it really is because I sit at the intersection of these spaces. So I do work in information integrity, and I've also worked at Twitter. I've worked with civil society organizations that have been subpoenaed. So just to give some like a timeline to substantiate the really helpful framing that Mark just shared. So I would say in February and March of last year, Jim Jordan began a series of Judiciary Committee hearings on the weaponization of the federal government, which is a very loaded framing. And I dropped a link in the chat so folks can read more. In the aftermath of that, we've seen subpoenas of independent researchers on disinformation at major academic institutions around the United States and democratic institutions like the National Democratic Institute and the National Endowment for Democracy. And we've seen increased data access challenges for researchers generally, and in part that comes from companies, as companies have increased the barriers to access for data by charging more and creating other barriers. We've also seen in July of last year, government agencies were barred from most communication with tech companies. This was a federal court decision made at a state, made in a state, but it really limited how government and companies can collaborate. And on top of that, in July of 2023, Twitter sued a nonprofit called the Center for Countering Digital Hate because of the research that they had put out about rising hate on Twitter's platform. All of these things have had a major chilling effect on independent researchers who are looking specifically at information integrity. And it has made it so much harder for these the research and the conversations to come to the fore. And as Mark has said, as a result, we're seeing much less public engagement on this issue at a time when companies are rolling back protections, either by rolling back policies or cutting trust and safety staff that are meant to actually do the enforcement work. And the combination of those things means that many companies like Twitter, now X, have enabled mis and disinformation to proliferate on their platforms. And so we've been seeing a degradation of the information quality while there are new barriers to folks looking to study and legislate on these issues.
All right, yeah, thank you very much for outlining this. I want to point out that the materials Theo's referring to, we will share them in the follow-up email, so you will receive all of these links. Maria is putting some of these into the chat, into the Q&A, but generally you will receive links to all these resources. I think Cobun, you're gonna lead us into the state conversation, so I'm gonna, if I may, keep you on the sidelines for just one more short deep dive. My screen has been full of antitrust news in the last week, and I'll put up this thesis that a couple of years ago there were some antitrust bills that didn't really make it across Congress because of the Congress issues that we have discussed before, and so this is one of the examples where, since Congress isn't acting, regulators / courts are starting to take the reins. I mean, examples that we've seen in the last week, certainly the Google cases. There's also sort of, it turns into an election topic when it comes to the staffing at the Federal Trade Commission, right? So the question whether Lina Khan will be in the FTC after the election. Theo, Mark, I think this goes to the two of you. Maybe Mark, you go first since Theo last had the word. Any thoughts on the antitrust debate?
Just this is a small topic. It's interesting, right? Because both the DOJ and the FTC historically have been very unsuccessful in these cases. And I would argue Lina Khan, as chairman of the FTC in this term, has been not very successful. You look at what they try to do with Microsoft and Activision, they try to do stuff with Facebook, it just hasn't stuck, right? The DOJ finally, after losing a couple of cases, and we should also add, in conjunction with a variety of US states, both Republican and Democratic leaning, they have been able to score a significant win against Google, and it's, now dominance, abusive dominance in search. And we saw last week when the DOJ suggested that they were looking at so-called structural remedies, which for everyone else, that means breaking Google up. That doesn't mean they're going to do that. Doesn't mean they're going to be successful. But I find it ironic that after a decade plus of the US saying, those pesky Europeans are going to break up Google, don't do that. It now turns out that the Europeans don't want to, and the Americans potentially do. So I do think there's been some success. And what we've seen on the court side is, and this may be just a shifting of generational change within the judges, is that they are more wary of the effect for consumers on dominance they have in the past. You look back at, say, the Microsoft cases, and yes, you know, Microsoft was seen as a dominant company, but that was seen as benefiting via lower prices to consumers, and therefore the judges was typically more favorable to dominance because consumers got cheaper prices. Whereas now we're seeing the potential effect of, say, Google being either broken up or no longer doing exclusive deals with Apple and Samsung to make Google the default search engine. That technically might lead to higher consumer prices, you know. And I'm not being paid by Google to say that, but it's a possible truth, because, you know, that is an outcome when you no longer can subsidize, Google can't subsidize Apple on its devices via search money, so things may get more expensive. But counter, you might be able to provide smaller rivals an opportunity of offering search on an iPhone that you wouldn't in the past. So I think in terms of the antitrust issue, there have been some short-term wins, particularly when it comes to Google. But I think of the last 4 years of Biden, it's not all been rosy, and the DOJ has lost cases. The FTC certainly has lost cases. And so in terms of like where we stand, I would say 60-40, it's in sort of the more aggressive antitrust camp, but it's not by any means, I would say, 180-degree shift in what we've seen in the US over the last, say, 2 decades.
Yeah, and maybe to sort of humanize what antitrust means on the ground. So for the last few years, I have been running a small nonprofit in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, called Cambridge Local First. We support locally and independently owned businesses, and these businesses have been really struggling in a lot of ways. The pandemic has been very hard, but increasingly, tech companies wield a kind of power that these small businesses cannot contend with. And so I'll drop some links in the chat, which will be translated to all of y'all shortly. But in 2022, we started collecting feedback from our members and sharing them with our Congress people and our senators here in Massachusetts. So Ayanna Pressley, Catherine Clark, Lori Trahan, and Elizabeth Warren, about how companies like Amazon and Google were creating anti-competitive spaces for small businesses. And during that time, there was a lot of legislation that got put forth, 2021, 2022, including Elizabeth Warren's piece at the beginning of 2022 on bicameral legislation to ban anti-competitive mergers, restore competition, and bring down prices for consumers. Because fundamentally, when we see competitive spaces, what we see is higher prices and less power at the local level for small businesses. When Democrats lost majority of the House, after 2022, a lot of this shifted to the state level. So we'll get to the state level very shortly. But what we've seen now is a lot more legislative work on antitrust coming from states like New York, Massachusetts, Maine, Utah, states around the country that are taking up this responsibility because they're seeing a Congress that isn't able to drive forward legislation on antitrust. And then, like Mark was saying, we're seeing a lot of work coming out of the executive branch from agencies like the Department of Justice and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, most notably around Google as a monopoly when it comes to search, but also maybe ads up next. So we're seeing work on antitrust now at the state level, and maybe that's a good segue to the state level conversation, as well as executive branch-led efforts that Mark described in good detail.
Yeah, I will definitely take the chance to move over to the state level, simply because I have been holding Cobun way too long on the back burner, knowing that he will now have a plethora of information. I think the stage is set in the sense that Washington isn't working. State level actors are moving themselves. What are they doing? What's crossing your desk? What are your thoughts on it, Cobun? Fill us in.
Sounds good. Okay, I'll try to be brief and comprehensive at the same time. And actually, before I do that, if it's okay, I might quickly mention that I think that what we were just talking about, the FTC, antitrust, but particularly the leadership of the FTC does matter both for antitrust and for consumer protection, including privacy. And that really is one of the big policy questions, right? It's one of the most debated questions right now is kind of this leadership of the FTC because of the amount of disagreement about how the past few years have gone, it is going to be it would be a very difficult fight to reconfirm Chair Khan to lead the agency. And so it does seem, like Mark said, fairly unlikely that she would retain. But for the moment, she's past the end of her term, and she gets to stay until she's replaced. And once we have a new president, they can decide from among the sitting commissioners who that's going to be. We have 4 others that are ready to go, and depending on who the president is, they might decide to pick from those rather than go through the lengthy Senate fight to get a new commissioner or reconfirm Chair Khan. Anyway, the states. So in the meantime, we all focus on the states, and I think privacy is a great example of this, and this is kind of, I guess, my main focus area, but I think it's also indicative of kind of state policy and the pattern that it takes overall. In the US, states often defer to especially on kind of new technologies, national issues, things where we would want the federal government to have standard rules. States often don't get involved, and they kind of wait to see what the federal government is going to do. Usually that's a period of decades, right? And that's kind of what we've seen in privacy. We've been talking about federal privacy legislation for 2 decades at least. And the states haven't really gotten involved until the past 5 years or so, at least on an aggressive level. But in those past 5 years, after California first passed comprehensive consumer privacy legislation, we saw a wave that has become an avalanche of, to mix metaphors, that has become an avalanche of legislation. The last year we saw this year we've seen 7 states passing comprehensive privacy law. The prior year was also 7. So we now are at a total of 19 states, 20 depending on how you count, that have what we call comprehensive consumer privacy laws. There's also a lot of other types of privacy laws and a lot of legislative activity around certain niches like biometrics and health and children's information, as Mark mentioned. And it's kind of its own, children's privacy and safety is its own set of legislative activity. But we're now at this period where almost half of the US population is covered by these laws that the states have put in place, explicitly saying that like they're doing this because the federal government hasn't acted. And these laws look very similar to some of the proposals at the federal level. So I would guess I would quickly just contrast that then to the patterns that we're seeing in AI governance legislation. I think it's really remarkable the speed with which state legislators have begun to consider guardrails for AI, given kind of the rise of that technology and our interest in it. The first wave of legislative activity there a few years ago was more concerned about government uses of AI systems, and there's been quite a few states that have passed various guardrails for that, and there's been a lot of states that have passed a lot of kind of study groups and things where they'll come back with recommendations later, kind of kicking off multi-year processes in the states. But in the last year, we've seen states actually begin to pass AI legislation relatively quickly. And I think those fit into, unlike privacy, those fit into a variety of different buckets. And that kind of tracks where the policy conversation has been overall. There's a lot of consternation and concern around the risks from generative AI systems. Gen AI is our big moment right now, and that's been one major theme in legislation that's proposed. We now have there's a law in Utah about just basic transparency for those types of systems. There's now 2 more laws in California that were just signed related to similar issues around transparency for Gen AI. And then there's a big bucket of laws that are about automated decision-making technologies. That really builds on privacy laws. There's 4 or 5 states that have rules around automated decision-making in their privacy laws. That's something that's in the GDPR as well. There's now kind of specific ADMT bills that are focused on AI systems and kind of adding on top of that existing baseline around the types of rights people should expect when systems are making decisions about them. But those laws, we had there was an they've suddenly become a hot button issue, and there's been a lot of debate. Even in blue states, Colorado, Connecticut, and California all saw major progress on 3 bills that look very similar this year. Connecticut failed to pass it after a threat of a veto. Colorado passed it, but the governor issued this very strange signing statement, basically saying that he hated the bill. And then California ended up failing to pass as well these automated decision-making systems rules. And so it's kind of a weird moment for those standards as to kind of what next year will look like, because there's a lot of chilling happening even from Democratic governors who you might expect to be on board with basic guardrails around civil rights protections for AI systems, but we haven't. Yeah, we'll see what happens with that next year. And then there's another. I'll quickly mention one other bucket, I guess, which is just kind of the broader AI governance type of standards, especially those that cover foundation models, big AI systems that might have many different uses, and that where we see a lot of our policy conversation happening. The governor of California just vetoed a law that had gotten a lot of industry pushback related, that would have set some of those guardrails up. And those are some of the kind of basic AI governance standards, putting those into enshrining them in law, saying you have to do testing in advance and some of these other things that are in the EU AI Act, actually. It's kind of undoubtedly we're going to see a continued focus on this, on both privacy and AI governance in the States in the next year, but it's unclear how much will pass, because it is becoming a little more political. We're starting to see more disagreement about these rules, and companies, as Theo mentioned, companies are getting involved. I should also mention that one last thing on privacy, we are suddenly seeing a real patchwork emerging. It used to be really, we say patchwork and companies are worried about a patchwork, but most of the laws are very similar. This year we saw Maryland pass, and that is really an indication of civil society groups also engaging much more heavily at the state level, federal level, civil society groups turning their attention from Congress and saying, listen, if all these bills are going to be passed, we want to be part of the conversation. And that is going to intensify next year with more of that activity. And that could lead to even more differences between these bills that have passed.
Well, that is one hell of a roundup of what's happening in the,
Yes.
in the US at the state level.
But it doesn't even cover the other issues like free speech and safety and all of the things. So yeah.
We do have to leave something for the others as well. So I think we're gonna move to the Q&A fairly soon. I do want to give Mark and Theo each a chance. Again, if possible, stay at the state level, or sort of, Mark, you've hinted to that, state issues getting to the Supreme Court at some point. So you can, the lines are blurry. Just your thoughts here on the state level conversation.
I'll keep it very brief because I'd like to get some Q&A. If I was anyone looking at US policy over the next 2 to 4 years, I would only look at states. I don't think anything's going to happen at the congressional level. Maybe the executive branch might get involved in the Supreme Court, but in terms of the wonkiness of actual legislation, the states is where it's at. There's a large variety from Utah to Connecticut about how they're doing this, but in terms of, the idea of sort of, was it Jefferson's of the states are sort of the crucible of democracy, where things, testing out ideas. I think that's where I'm only going to focus my time on US policy making.
And so to wrap things up, first, I will very briefly screen share again our legislative tracker, but this time focused on the state side of things. So first we were focused on federal, and now if I can, there we go. This is US state. So I encourage folks to check this out and see the legislation that's been moved forward. And theoretically, you can see the status here. Hopefully it's totally up to date. It's a lot of work, as you can imagine, to keep this updated, but we do our best. And then if you look here at the state level issues that have received a lot of attention, you can see privacy, online safety, AI, and accessibility are ones that have received a lot of attention. And this is a little bit of an outdated slide because this was created months ago and the legislative cycle has moved forward. But again, you can see the status of legislation at different levels, from passed, pending all the way to pass the Senate on these different themes. And again, children, privacy, and child safety. These are all some pretty big issues. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight specifically in the context of AI, notably in the last few weeks, California's governor has signed into bill 2 laws around misleading deepfakes in elections, but didn't pass, or he vetoed a major AI safety bill that was being discussed that did pass both houses, and then would have prevented AI systems from causing catastrophes by holding big AI vendors liable if their products were used to create or cause grievous harm, like bringing down critical infrastructure. So this was widely debated, but ultimately got vetoed. But as you can see, like major AI legislation is being discussed, debated, and then is moving forward to some extent at the state level. And then I will share a resource around antitrust. Again, this has made major inroads, although it hasn't necessarily been successful. It's very hard, but in states like Maine, New York, and Massachusetts, and I'm actually writing a bill, or writing language that will be submitted as a bill, hopefully at the start of next year, on antitrust in Massachusetts. Again, recognizing, like Mark said, that really the time is good for moving legislation forward at the state level right now.
Excellent. Thank you all also for keeping these remarks brief, so we have some time for Q&A. We have some questions on children's online safety, which is, I think, a very hot topic. So, Sarah, thank you for the question. I think even though you state you're a non-American, it seems you're following the discourse. I think the Kids Online Safety Act at the federal level, and then several, to Arkansas, for example, states having child online safety laws out there. So I think it's a very good topic to focus on. I'll try to summarize your questions here, because if I read them, we'll be out of time. So one is about a conflict between different states or federal regulation. So how the geolocation tracking of children intersects with federal and state regulations. How does that work? What happens if a child from New York travels to California? Which law takes precedent? Is there one of you who has thought through these kinds of issues? We're getting technical here, but I'm happy to yield the floor to whoever feels comfortable.
I'm happy to chat about it quickly. That's a complicated question, and I think we don't have enough time to go too in the weeds. I think I would quickly answer just that that, like a good lawyer, I'll say that it depends. But right now we don't have restrictions on geolocation tracking, except in the sense that it's sensitive data. It's covered for children under 13. It's covered. There are various ways that it'll be implicated in child safety laws, including rules about making sure that you would disclose to children anytime that tracking is taking place in a long over time, if it remains on, making sure that there's still an indication of that to the child or teen user. Often companies will come into compliance with these types of rules at a national level rather than try to implement specific safeguards for specific states. So that somewhat answers your question about if a child travels from one state to another. Usually companies, until we start to see very onerous restrictions, companies are not going to go through the effort of creating different rules for different states usually. And then I think the second part of your question about parental consent definitely triggers a major issue and debate right now, which is whether the trend toward asking for more verification of children's age and parental status and things like that leads to less privacy, leads to the collection of more information. And how do we get that balance right? That's a really tricky policy question that no one's quite figured out, and the platforms have strong opinions on it, but it's still, including platforms like the device platforms, which would answer your question about whether each app needs to collect new information. One way you could do that is the phone knows who's a child or not, but the device manufacturers have been reluctant to try to send a signal with every child user for various reasons, including privacy. So it's really tricky questions.
And I just wanted to add, so I'm actually working on a paper right now, which hopefully will be published in a few days with All Tech is Human, specifically looking to address this issue, the tensions between privacy and child safety when it comes to specifically end-to-end encrypted spaces. There is a real tension between advocates on both sides, because the more we enable privacy, the less we can either moderate content, which could include content around child sexual abuse. And so there are real tensions between these two communities. It is an unresolved debate. I am seeing increased conversation around user-reported tools as one way to reconcile this, but it is a very it is a huge debate ongoing now in child safety and privacy ecosystems.
Mark, I think we're gonna no, we have another question. Sorry, I hadn't seen that. So maybe this is for Mark, or whoever wants to go here. So regarding access to platform data for researchers, so Thea, you've touched upon this point. Mark, you have as well done considerable research on this. I think this is the last question we get into. It's a good one. It's a thorny one. So will we be seeing some more actionable legislation similar to the EU's Digital Services Act? I think this question is basically designed for Mark, so I'll hand that over to you.
So to be very clear and full transparent, data access is primarily my day job. I'm looking to implement and operationalize the DSA data access provision. So as you say, Tommaso, this is seems whoever the question is. Thank you so much for letting me drone on a little bit. We're not going to get DSA style rules in the US. It's just not going to happen. So forget about it. The DSA in Europe is very different. In the European Union is very different than the Online Safety Act in both Australia and the United Kingdom. What the Canadians are up to, which is a hybrid of the DSA and OSA, to get really technical, is also maybe not having data access. So if you're looking at data access in some sort of CrowdTangle style model, the European model is the only one available for the short term. The Brits aren't going to touch it again. The Australians are only starting to look at their issues. So it's the DSA or nothing on data access. As much as I was a massive overuser of CrowdTangle since the beginning, it's not coming back. The new content library that Meta set up, which I've been using, is bad, but it's better than anyone else. Does that make sense? So I think in terms of any type of US legislation around data access is going to be piggybacking on the back of the DSA, which they try to do via the EU-US Trade and Tech Council meetings. But that very much depends on November, and the White House is definitely not prioritizing data access ahead of November. It's more on other issues like the Cybercrime Convention out of the UN. So unfortunately, and this is not to be a cheerleader for the European Union, but the DSA is the only game in town at the moment.
All right, thank you very much. I think that was about it. I'm wary of your time, of course, as panelists and our audiences as well. I have learned a lot. I've had fun even listening to all of you. I think it's a diverse set of perspective. I think you are all extremely informed on a lot of different issues when it comes to the US and the international context. So thank you from the Digital Policy Alert side for joining us, for giving us your views, for being frank and realistic. Thank you to our audience. Again, what we will follow up with is an email. I will link sources to the work of our three panelists, as well as some external sources that were discussed today. So with this, I'd like to conclude. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.